After the esophagus comes the stomach. Now, the stomach is a fairly large organ, and it's made up of different regions. So the region around the input, where the esophagus enters, is called the cardiac region. Uh, it surrounds the cardiac orifice, which is the where the lower esophageal sphincter is. Um, it's called the cardia because it's up right next to the heart. This is the place where you actually get heartburn when you have indigestion. Above that is an area called the fundus, which is a pouch above, which is why they call it the Bay of Fundy. The body is the mid portion of it. And then there's kind of a funnel region called the pyloric region. Um, the outside curve is the greater curvature, and the inside curve is the lesser curvature. So it all works like this. The esophagus is here, the lower esophageal sphincter is here. This is the cardia. This part above is the fundus, and it's only used when you are full. From here to here is the body. This funnel-shaped area is the pylorus, and this is the pyloric sphincter. The lesser curvature here, the greater curvature out here. The walls have a mucosa and a submucosa. The muscularis has 3 layers of muscles. There's a circular layer, a longitudinal layer, and an oblique layer, because the propulsion is more about churning. You will also notice that inside it's thrown into folds called rugae, and this increases surface area and also allows for expansion of the stomach. When the stomach is empty, the rugae are deeper and more numerous. When the stomach is full, it stretches out and those flatten out. So it allows the stretch of the stomach as it fills. So the outside of the stomach has got a mesentery, but we don't call it the mesentery so much. We call it the omentum. So from the liver to the lesser curvature is the lesser omentum, and the greater omentum runs from the greater curvature, and it hangs down and it ends up joining in front of the small intestines. We're not going to get too much into it, except that the greater omentum almost lays like an apron, and it's full of fat. Oftentimes, people's belly fat is fat deposited in the greater omentum here. The stomach is here. So it basically looks like this. The mesentery comes from the underside here of the liver. So it comes from the body wall over the liver, then comes together as the omentum, the lesser omentum here, goes around the stomach, and then the greater omentum hangs down here and attaches there. The stomach is supplied by the sympathetics and the parasympathetics. There's splanchnic nerves. The parasympathetic is vagus nerve. Parasympathetic excites the stomach. Sympathetics inhibit. Blood is supplied via the celiac trunk by the left and right gastric, the gastroepiploic, and it's drained by the hepatic portal vein that we talked about before. Again, there's the 4 tunics. The mucosa is special, and the muscularis, I've already said, there's 3 layers, and it's designed for churning. The mucosa is very different than the rest of the digestive system. It is actually um, formed of these mucosal glands, as it were. It's columnar epithelium thrown into these deep pits, the gastric pits, and that extend right down into the lamina propria. There is a slight muscularis mucosa. Submucosa is about the same. Like I say, the muscularis has 3 layers, and the serosa is a typical serosa. So when we look at it here, we can see the different types of cells that are found. Even though they're all epithelial cells, they are slightly different and they have different functions, and they're represented here by different colors. It's a simple epithelium. It's a columnar epithelium, and most of the cells in it are goblet cells, mucus cells. And the mucus traps a bicarbonate rich fluid underneath it. And these two things protect the stomach from autodigesting, from digesting itself. The stomach is a very acidic environment, and there are very powerful enzymes that happen there, especially for breaking down proteins. And the walls are made out of proteins. So you don't want the stomach to digest itself. So it protects itself by this thick layer of mucus and some alkaline fluid below it. So, and there are these pits, and at the bottom of each pit is glandular epithelium. So these are called the gastric glands. Again, we'll look at them here. The cells that are involved, so the surface cells here are all mucus secreting cells, and they're called the surface epithelium. This opening is called the gastric pit. Below here, we have another type of mucus cell that just below the surface epithelial cells, at the beginning of the gastric gland, there are mucus cells that are called the neck cells. And the mucus that is secreted by these surface cells is alkaline. It's rich in bicarbonates. The mucus by these mucus neck cells, the difference is that it's weakly acidic. We'll kind of see why soon. There are other cells here, these ones that are kind of turquoise in color, that are called the parietal cells. It means the cells of the walls, right? And then there are these cells here that are called the chief cells. They tend to be down at the bottom of the gland. And then scattered around are various enteroendocrine cells. So these produce the hormones. So the 4 cell types are the neck cells, the thin acidic mucus, parietal cells, chief cells, and enteroendocrine cells. Now, the chief cells produce pepsinogen, which is an inactive form of the enzyme pepsin. Now, it's the chief thing that is done by the stomach is peptide bonds in proteins are broken. So proteins are chemically digested by the enzyme pepsin. But if you were to release pepsin in an active form, then the pepsin would break the peptide bonds in the proteins of the cell membranes, and they would destroy all the cells in the gastric gland. So it's got to be in an inactive form. What activates it is actually hydrochloric acid. The parietal cells are what secrete hydrochloric acid. They make hydrochloric acid from basically from blood, from interstitial fluid. They remove the acid and the hydrogen and the chlorine and make hydrochloric acid. The enteroendocrine cells, like I say, produce hormones that regulate other parts of the digestive system. So the secretions are a mixture of all of this stuff. There's this weak acidic mucus, there's hydrochloric acid, and it's very strong acid, pH of 1.5. This would eat the paint off of a car. It's involved with denaturing proteins in the food, opening them up to make them digestible. It activates pepsin, and it's very unfriendly to bacteria, so it kills most bacteria that are ingested with the food. It also makes a substance called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is very important because it's what allows you to absorb vitamin B12. You don't digest vitamin B12, but without intrinsic factor, you don't absorb it. So intrinsic factor is made when the glands are stimulated by the presence of food. People that don't eat enough don't make intrinsic factor, which means then they can't absorb their vitamin B12. And B12 is necessary for red blood cell production, so these people get anemia. People that go to Dr. Bernstein for weight loss don't get enough food to make enough intrinsic factor to absorb B12. So they have to go for B12 injections. It's not that there's a lack of B12 in the food, it's just that you put B12 rich food in your mouth and you get B12 rich poo coming out the other end. You don't absorb any. The only way to get it in, therefore, is to put it in a needle and inject it directly into the bodily fluids. For the most part, that's not a problem with most of us, but it is an indispensable factor that the stomach does for us, intrinsic factor. The chief cells make pepsinogen. That's really all they do. Pepsinogen becomes pepsin by hydrochloric acid. And then the pepsin feeds back and stops the production of hydrochloric acid. So it becomes a self-regulating thing. The enteroendocrine cells are hormones. So somatostatin, gastrin. So these are things that that help with gastric motility, things like that. Now, without this bicarbonate-rich mucus on the surface, you're going to have some problems where the active pepsin will start to actually auto-digest. Now, even at that, the epithelial cells get damaged a lot, and they're constantly being replaced. So these epithelial cells are in a very high rate of mitosis. That's one of the reasons that people that go for chemotherapy, which targets cells in mitosis, often get stomach problems. They have digestive issues because of it. It's a very difficult situation in the stomach, because in order for the stomach to work and denature these proteins and break the peptide bonds, it can actually hurt itself. Now, the next couple of slides are on homeostatic imbalance. It's really talking about gastritis and peptic ulcers, and a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. I'm only going to mention it for a concept that we will be using later. The problem with something like Helicobacter pylori, they've adapted to live in this harsh environment of the stomach, but they are found in the lumen of the stomach, which is outside of the body, which means that the immune system can't get at them. So they are pretty much hiding from the immune system because they're not in you. If you get this bacteria, then what it does is it changes the properties of the mucus around where they're colonized, and the mucus doesn't protect, and the stomach auto-digests. And so it ends up with ulcers, holes, not very pleasant. This brings us to the whole idea too, that because the lumen is separate, a lot of GI infections, like the ones you get when you go to Mexico and things like that, you need to take an antibiotic that doesn't go inside your body but stays in your digestive system in order to fight it. It's not the same antibiotics as you need for an infection that's actually inside your body, because these are two separate areas. So what happens in the stomach? The first thing that happens is this mechanical digestion, physical digestion, breaking down of the food and liquefying it. So you start out by chewing it and mechanically breaking it down, but you further mechanically break it down with the acidity in the stomach and the churning of the stomach, and the addition of secretions of watery things actually starts to liquefy the food. The proteins, any globular proteins or proteins with any sort of tertiary structure, get denatured, and so they open up, and as they open up and become more fibrous, they become more prone to being attacked by the enzymes that will break the peptide bonds between the amino acids. So the denaturing of proteins is very good for enhancing the chemical digestion. Now, another way to denature proteins is with heat. So cooking, the process of cooking actually denatures the proteins and helps it make it easier to digest chemically. So the chemical digestion that happens is really that of proteins, and it's gross digestion of proteins. It breaks proteins into big polypeptides by breaking peptide bonds. And then it delivers all of this to the small intestine, to the duodenum. And so there is kind of mechanisms that do it. We'll talk about in a minute. It's regulated by both hormones, but mostly by neural mechanisms. There's 3 phases of stimulating secretion of the stomach. The first phase is called the cephalic phase. Cephalic means head. This is what happens in your head. This is triggered by the thought of food, by the sight of food, by the smell of food. It's a physiological reflex that prepares your digestive system for the intake of food. It's very important, right? But it's also the basis of what I like to call food porn, a physiological reaction to the sight or thought of food. It's It's parasympathetic in nature, so it calms you down. It's restful. It prepares you for digestion. It can be triggered by pictures of food. This is why cookbooks all have pictures. This is why people watch the Food Network. Very few people watch the Food Network and then make the recipes. Mostly they find it very relaxing and calming because they trigger the cephalic phase. The cephalic phase is actually what you're looking for when you are when you're eating to calm your nerves, things like that. That's why what happens. It's why you chew on a pencil, because it'll calm you. It puts you a little bit into the cephalic phase. So this is still, if when food gets into your mouth, you're still in this. When the food gets into your stomach, it's called the gastric phase. So this is as you're processing the foods that are there. So cephalic starts the secretions. Gastric keeps the secretions going. And this is important because this is when the mechanical and chemical digestion start to occur. Now, the third phase is called the intestinal phase. And this is the phase when the stomach starts squirting some of this processed food and secretions into the duodenum. And as it enters the duodenum, it gives an inhibitory feedback to the stomach and really to your head as well. So this is when you don't feel like eating anymore. This is when you're feeling full. This is really stopping the acceleration of the gastric reflex and basically putting it on cruise control to make it slow down, because you don't need any more secretions, you just need time. So the cephalic phase is sight, thought of food, smell, taste receptors, right? It all happens through the vagus nerve. Then the gastric phase happens in the stomach, and then by stretch receptors, by chemoreceptors, things like that. The third phase, the intestinal phase, happens, and it's a negative feedback. It inhibits. So I'm not going to worry too much about how much hydrochloric acid is secreted, but basically acetylcholine, histamine are two of the big ones, gastrin as well, which is a hormone, to stimulate the parietal cells. They make the hydrochloric acid. And we don't really care about that. When the stomach stretches to accommodate incoming food, then you get this plasticity. The walls of the stomach contract at first, and then they relax and accommodate the new size. It's one of the reasons why, if you eat slowly, you can eat more. If you eat quickly, you feel full sooner because of this stress relaxation response. If you slowly stretch the stomach, it will adapt to the new size, and then you stretch it again and it adapts to the new size. If you stretch it a lot right at once, then it's going to contract and not adapt so easily. There are peristaltic waves that move down the stomach and towards the pylorus. We don't really care about the cells of Cajal and that kind of thing, but what you really need to kind of see is that there's this wave of peristalsis. We'll get to that in a second. The peristalsis gets a little more vigorous as you get near the pylorus. Now, the pylorus is like a funnel. it's probably best to think of it as an icing bag. You know those bags that you fill and to squeeze out icing and decorate cakes? The reason that those things work is because as you squeeze, a measured amount of icing comes through the tip. You squeeze it harder, all that ends up happening is the icing moves further up the bag away from your hand. The tip limits the flow. So it does the exact same thing. When the stomach squeezes, some of it ends up coming out in a measured flow into the duodenum. The rest of it sloshes back into the stomach to do it again. The part that ends up going into the duodenum is the most liquefied food, and the stuff that ends up sloshing back is the less liquefied food. So the stuff that takes longer to digest and break down is in the stomach longer, and the stuff that is easy to break down is in the stomach for a shorter period of time. And the duodenum, through the pyloric sphincter, gets a measured amount with each contraction, with each wave of peristalsis. Now, we don't really call it food anymore because there's as much secretion mixed with what you've ingested as there is stuff that you ingested. So we call, and it's not in the same form because it's now denatured and it's broken down and it's liquefied. So we call this chyme. Looks like it's spelled chime, but it's pronounced chyme. So this moves from the stomach and into the duodenum, right? The duodenum then further processes it. If it's carbohydrate rich, it doesn't stay in the duodenum for very long. If it's fatty, it stays in the duodenum a lot longer. It's the reason why fatty foods are more satiating than empty calories. Processed sugars go through really quickly. Fat takes a long time. And it's the presence of that stuff, that chyme in the duodenum, that causes the intestinal phase of gastric secretion and suppresses your appetite. So a little bit of fat goes a long way to making you feel like you're not hungry again an hour later. So this is a chart that looks at stimulation and inhibition for that gastric emptying. The duodenum has enteroendocrine cells as well. That gets the gallbladder moving, a few things like that, and feeds back to the stomach. And there's chemoreceptors, stretch receptors, that kind of thing, that all regulate back the rate of gastric emptying. So the duodenum only takes on what it can take on.